Good evening and welcome to the Greek Centre. I also welcome those joining us through the various streaming services. My name is Spiridula Dimitriou and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria. I would like to commence by acknowledging that the Kulin nations are the traditional custodians of the land upon which we are gathered. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I also extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We are here tonight to hear the Pontian Genocide Memorial Lecture to be delivered by Dean Kalimiou. Our hosts are the Central Pontian Association of Melbourne, Medina Pontian Oceania, and the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria in conjunction with the Australian Federation of Pontian Associations. Today is the 19th of May and is the date that was designated by the Greek Parliament in 1994 for the yearly remembrance of the Pontian Genocide. The significance of this date being that Mustafa Kemal, the President of the Turkish Republic, on the 19th of May in 1919 intensified the campaign against the Pontian Greeks in Samsunda. This campaign had commenced in 1916. The Greek Centre tonight is lit up in red to mark the remembrance of the Pontian Genocide. The red light symbolises the 350,000 Pontian people who perished during this campaign. In this lecture tonight, Dean Kalimiou will take us back 2,000 years to discuss a genocide planned in Pontus that shocked the world. I now ask Simela, who's the President of the Australian Federation of Pontian Associations, to the podium to commence proceedings.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Christos Anesti. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. Today's event is a collaboration between the Central Pontian Association of Melbourne and Victoria, Pontiaki Estia, Meribna Pontion Kirion Oceania, and the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne. The event is sponsored by Roma Siahu in memory of Olga Syrianidou. Today's presentation has become a tradition at this stage, an established annual presentation by Dean Kalimiou as part of the commemorative events for the Greek genocide during the month of May, and specifically the Pontian Genocide Remembrance Day, which is today, the 19th of May. Dean's topic today is the first Pontian genocide, Mithradates and Rome. I must admit to finding this title quite provocative to begin with, but that is the genius of it. It forces you to revisit history and view events in a different light. Still, many questions hang in my mind, so I very much look forward to hearing Dean's speech. Before I proceed to introduce Dean, I would like to mention that he has authored a bilingual children's book titled Simela and the Magic Kemenche, which delves into the genocide of the Pontians in an age-appropriate way, is very possibly the first of its type. The book launch will be held on the 29th of May at the Pan-Acadian building in North Melbourne. Konstantinos Kalimniou is a lawyer, poet, short story writer, journalist, and now an author of a children's book. His list of achievements grow by the year. He has published 7 poetry collections in Greek and translated the work of many local Greek authors into English, also collaborating to translate the Papadiamantis short stories in the critical anthology, The Boundless Garden, Selected Short Stories. Dean was awarded a Government of Victoria Award for Excellence in Multicultural Affairs by the Governor of Victoria at the time, Professor David Di Cresta. The Greek community in Melbourne is richer for having him. Ευχαριστώ σε πολλά, Κωνσταντίνε. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Kalimiou.
Δεν ξέρω τι να πω μετά από αυτή την εισαγωγή και νιώθω λίγο άβολα βλέποντας ότι οι περισσότεροι εδώ πέρα είναι ελληνόφωνοι, όμως θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. To begin with, I think it's appropriate that we be upstanding for a minute's silence in memory of the victims of the Pontian genocide. αιωνία του συμνήμη. Okay, so one thing that we like to do, and as President Simela said, having this lecture is an annual tradition, and we thank Ms. Zoroastrian for sponsoring tonight's lecture in memory of her niece, Olga Siranidou, a very brave Pontian woman. What we try and do here is we try, in order to understand the magnitude of the loss, culturally, ethnically, linguistically, of the Pontian genocide, we need to understand the 3,000 years of Pontian Greek history that preceded that loss. It's only when you understand the full breadth and richness of that heritage that you can actually appreciate what was lost in the events that culminated in 1922 and the genocide. And tonight we're going to ask a question, and we specifically chose this topic to ask this question: when is a genocide a genocide? We're all familiar with the Pontian genocide, which was perpetrated against the Greeks of Pontus by the Ottomans and then the Kemalists. And this event looms large in our consciousness as a people, but it was not the first time that a genocide existed that had a link with Pontus. So tonight we're going back about 2,000 years or thereabouts. We're going back to 88 BC. We're going back to Hellenistic times, to one of the deadliest recording massacres of history in classical antiquity. And while we're used to being, as Greeks, the victims of genocide, this is one of the occasions when the act of genocide was committed, or rather, more accurately, if you like, orchestrated by people that had a connection to Pontus themselves. So this is where the shoe is on the other foot. And we're looking at the mirror image of 1922. Possibly, I don't know. That's why we're asking the question. We can have this discussion later. So, we go back to the period. Kingdom of Pontus, there it is. All of that, and all the way up there. Ruled by Mithradates Evpator, is at war with the neighboring kingdom of Bithynia, which is to the left. Now, both of the rulers of these kingdoms were derived from Persian satrapies that were not conquered by Alexander the Great. So we're talking about two kingdoms that were not part of Alexander's empire. They remained outside of his conquests. They were part of the Persian Empire before Alexander, however. So the ruling families of these two kingdoms, Bithynia and Pontus, are not Greek per se. They are descended from high-ranking Persians with connections to the traditional ruling family of the Persians. Now, Mithradates, or to give his full name, since he's the main character, if you like, and there he is, what a lovely guy he is too, Mithradates Evpator Dionysios, was of mixed Persian and Greek ancestry. So he claimed descent from Cyrus the great king of Persia, the family of Darius the Great, the regent Antipatros, the general of Alexander the Great, and also the Hellenistic kings Antigonos Monophthalmos, the one-eyed, he was the first Collingwood supporter in history, and Seleucus Nicator. And his name, what does Mithradates mean? Yes, it ends with S, but it's not a Greek name. Is the Greek attestation of the Persian name Mithradat, which means given by Mithra, and Mithra was a god of the Persians. It's the name of an ancient Iranian sun god, giving you some idea about how complex the makeup of the region is. In the time that we're talking about, you have a Hellenized Persian ruling class in Pontus. We have Greek colonists on the coasts. We have the ancestors of the Laz, which are a Proto-Georgian speaking people in the east, and we have another number of tribes which are mentioned by the historians, such as Moschians, Lefkosiri, Mares, Makrones, Mosiniki, and Tibarini, all these names. So we're talking about an area which is undergoing Hellenization, but still, at this time, is still really on the periphery of the Greek world. That's important to know. So Mithradates' aim, being in this wonderful, fertile, rich place, a place which is at the crossroads of civilizations and trading routes, there's sea, there's mountains, there's everything you can think of. His main aim is to transform the kingdom of Pontus into a regional superpower, in which he was kind of like possibly the Vladimir Putin of his time. And spookily enough, his earlier career mirrors that of Vladimir. He subjugates Kolchis, which is modern-day Georgia, and we remember the Georgian War that the Russians held in 2008. And then he went on to cow the cities of the Crimea and the hinterland beyond, in the same region, exactly the same region in which war is being waged now in the Ukraine. It's almost spooky that it's almost exactly the same territory we're talking about. He incorporates all these areas into his kingdom. It's massive. It's not just the bottom of the Black Sea, it's up the top as we saw in the map earlier. And then he turns his gaze to Asia Minor, and he considers it strategically important to dominate the region for many reasons. One is because that's what you do when you're a Hellenistic king. You pick on other Hellenistic kings and try and take their kingdom, because then there's money and slaves and tribute, and Alexander's the precedent for that. But there's also another thing. To the west, there's this other emerging power which is called Rome. And Rome has already taken over mainland Greece, the kingdom of Macedonia. They've got a foothold in Asia because the king of Pergamum has bequeathed the kingdom of Pergamum to Rome. So, I mean, that is I think, if you like, how can we say, quintessentially Greek attribute. King Attalos dies, has no one to bequeath his kingdom to. The kingdom of Pergamum is Ionia, okay? He says, what am I going to do? Rather than give it to another Greek kingdom, I'm going to leave it to Rome. And all of a sudden, Rome, this military, acquisitive, expansionist power, is on the doorstep of the Hellenic world in Asia Minor. And that's a kind of problem. And it's a problem because he can see that Rome, for all its attestations of friendship and goodwill to all peoples and the rule of law, was a state whose business model was aggression, expansion, looting and pillaging. And for this reason, he decides to partition the region of Paphlagonia, that's the buffer state between Bithynia and Pontus, with King Nicomedes of Bithynia, his main rival. Now, Rome doesn't like this. And Rome had begun to interfere in Asia Minor ever since Rhodes had asked their assistance to mediate in a dispute over land holdings that they held there. And we talked about Attalus, who was the king of Pergamum, and there he is, and a kingdom which encompassed the western half of Asia Minor, who gave his kingdom to the Romans, so they got the foothold there, just like the Silugi, who would rather bequeath their assets in the event of a wind-up to the Royal Children's Hospital than to another Greek Silugo, but let's not go there. So Rome, that's the kingdom of Attalus there. So that's basically the Roman foothold at the time. They're dominating that space in the period that we're talking about. Rome's a player, and Rome is a massively dominating player. And they begin to play the role of global policemen. And I don't know if that reminds you of any other modern state. None come to the top of my head, but I'll leave that to you. Rome's suspicious of Mithradates, and they consider him an obstacle to their domination of the region, and they don't want him to expand his kingdom. Nicomedes, the king of Bithynia, also doesn't want to see an aggressive king bent on territorial expansion on his doorstep. So from Nicomedes' point of view, it makes sense to try and stop Mithradates' takeover of the kingdom of Cappadocia, which is that green bit in the middle. He enlists the help of the Romans. And the Romans interfered twice in the conflicts between Nicomedes and Mithradates. There are battles between the two kingdoms, which mean that if Mithradates wants to continue the expansion of his kingdom, eventually he's going to have to confront Rome head on. And the germ of an idea, pardon the pun, the germ of an idea generates in his mind that the Romans, they just have to go. It's not tenable for them to be in Asia Minor any longer. We can't have it. And what happens next exacerbates the situation and reinforces this instinct in the mind of Mithradates. Bithynia and Pontus ask the Roman Senate to arbitrate in relation to their dispute. So we can't make up our minds. There's no other umpire. You Romans, we'll take it to you. Whatever you say, we'll abide by that. Kind of like the world court of their day. And after deliberation, the Senate, surprise, surprise, decide to back Bithynia and not Pontus. Now, Mithradates accepts this decision. Says, fine, you win some, you lose some. I've lost this one, bloody Romans, but that's okay. We'll accept it. And the old king of Bithynia dies, though. And we have, conveniently enough, a new king called Nicomedes. Nicomedes the fourth, the other one was the third of Bithynia, who's a figure who is very much manipulated by the Romans. Mithradates tries to overthrow him because there's nothing more calculated to win you brownie points than destabilizing your neighbor, but his attempts fail. And Nicomedes basically egged on by his Roman advisors, decide to declare war on Pontus, because this is what's happening. The Senate wants peace, and the Senate at this stage of Rome wants the warring parties not to fight with each other, settle the dispute. But in Bithynia itself, Nicomedes has what are called military advisors from Rome, and those military advisors are the hawks of the whole story, and they try and convince him that even though the Senate says, don't fight, you've sorted it out, there's not going to be any change in territory, everything else, what Rome really means is go to war against Mithradates, and they're doing that for their own reason. They're doing that because the Roman military, the generals and people of that nature want to have triumphs, they want to have military victories, they get to keep loot and plunder and glory in Rome, they get to be major players in the Roman political scene. So, kind of like the hawks in the Pentagon, for example, convincing the State Department to invade, a country, and everyone else has to go along. Something like that. So Rome at this time is involved in what's called the social war. And the social war is a civil war with its Italian allies, because at that stage, the Italian allies in the Italian peninsula were not fully, they were fully integrated politically into the Roman state, but they still had their own specific identities. They were not Romans, they were Italians. It was a different thing. As a result, there's only 2 legions present in Asia Minor, which is not many. And these legions combine with Nicomedes' army to invade Mithradates' kingdom of Pontus, and that happens in 89 BC. So there's a war, and the Romans are assisting Nicomedes to fight Mithradates of Pontus. Now, notwithstanding this blatant act of aggression, Mithradates tries diplomatic channels in order to avert a war. He is rebuffed by Rome, because by this stage Rome is cocky, and Rome is convinced that this act is going to be successful, and they're going to get a lot of plunder, and it's going to be brilliant. Now, this confidence is misplaced, because Mithradates was one of the most brilliant, the wiliest, the most resilient military commanders of ancient times, and he wins a decisive victory, and he scatters the Roman-led forces. Now, while Mithradates is doing this, he's thinking, these Romans are a problem, Nicomedes of Bithynia is a problem, what can I do apart from this military confrontation to shore up my position, protect the kingdom, make sure I live to fight another day? One of the things he decides to do is to create allies amongst the other Greek states which are in Asia Minor, and there's heaps of them, especially in the west. And by this time, mainland Greece has tasted Roman occupation, and the Greeks are mightily fed up with the Romans. They're not happy. This whole idea of the Romans being liberators and uniters of Hellenism and protectors of Hellenism, which is what they presented themselves as being, and they always did this, it's not working. So viewed from this perspective, and we can have a discussion about this later, we can possibly, if tenuously and anachronistically, view Mithradates' policy as the first colonialist or anti-colonialist campaign in history. And if we stretch the paradigm a little bit, one of the first nationalistic wars of liberation. So one of the things that the Pontian family does, the Pontian royal family, which as we said was of Iranian descent, Persian descent, they moved the capital from Amasya, where it had been, and that's Amasya, and they're the royal tombs of the Pontian kings carved inside the mountain. If you go to Amasya, you can see them. So they decided to move the city from Amasya, which was a native dynasty, the native inhabitants of the region before the Greeks ever got there, because surprise, surprise, we weren't there from the beginning. We came as colonists later. And they moved to the Greek city of Sinope, because Sinope was a Greek foundation on the coast. And that's to emphasize that Hellenic component, the fact that he is of the Greeks. He's not, but they're a bit dozy. The whole idea is to be all things to all men. And Mithradates shows a Greek face to the Greeks, an Iranian, Anatolian face to the Eastern world, and he poses as a champion of Hellenism, but from what we can ascertain from the historians of the time, and of course they're biased, so we have to be careful, and we have to take their words with a grain of salt. People like Appian and Livy, who were Romans, this was mainly this espousal of the outward attributes of Hellenism was basically in order to further his own admissions and for the purpose of self-preservation. We don't really have proof that he felt this mission to promote the extension of Hellenism within his domains. But nonetheless, the Greek cities being fed up, especially those of Asia Minor, they fell for it. And, you know, why wouldn't they? The historians of the time record that having swept aside the Roman legions, he started attacking them and sending them sprawling away from the territory that he was conquering. Mithradates was greeted in the areas that he liberated from the Romans as a saviour and liberator from Roman occupation. This was an occupation, and we need to stress this, that had resulted in loss of liberty, and liberty was a very, very important concept from the Greeks. The idea that each city should determine its own future. We're still talking about city-states, even though there are Hellenistic kingdoms and in existence, but the idea that there is no interference in the running of a city is an idea which is very, very much held dear by Greeks, and obviously Rome doesn't help. So there's that. There's the looting of art and antiquities that were shipped directly to Rome, and there were onerous taxes. It was not fun, always, to be under Rome. And also in the possibly, I think, this is my personal belief, but I believe that the whole idea of Orientalism, and Orientalism is a whole concept which was created by Edward Said when he wrote a famous essay about the West feminizing and degrading the East in order to dominate it. Okay, so Easterners are corrupt, Easterners are sexually and morally ambivalent, the Easterners are, if you like, more lax, less vigorous, less virile, these kind of things. That starts from the Romans when they come in contact with the Greeks, and they start presenting the Greeks in that way. So that idea, the putting down the Greeks, considering them incapable of determining their own fates, racially inferior, even though their civilization is attractive, and that they had to be dominated for their own good, that's something that comes from the Romans. And it's a discourse within their own society, and they're arguing about it. Should we follow the Greeks? Why are we following the Greeks? The Greeks have too much luxury. We Romans are strong and virtuous, and they're not. And this is being played out in Rome, this cultural conflict continuously. But compared to all that's going on, Mithradates is heaven sent, because Mithradates is saying, I'm going to turn the clock back to the way you were before, and I'm going to guarantee your liberty, and you can go off and do whatever you want. The bit about you've got to pay me tribute will come later. So when the Pontian army enters the cities of Roman Asia, they're greeted by the Greeks cheering. Is that a cheering? No, that's anyway. From the windows and the balconies, and flowers are thrown over their marching columns. It's the works, and Greek residents go off and they demolish signs of Roman authority, pulling over those flagstones, things statues, whatever, knocking down Roman monuments and expelling officials. It's for them the beginning of a new era. This is the beginning of the freedom of the Greeks. And we need to mention at this point, because it is important, that the way that the Romans dealt with population growth and the way they financed expansion of their empire was by creating colonies and settling soldiers in the conquered territories, and they would grant them land and privileges. And if you're a legionary and if you had served 20 years in the army, they would give you a block of land, for example, in Pontus, well, not Pontus, wasn't conquered, somewhere else, in Asia Minor near Ephesus, for example. There you go, that's your farm, you go and farm it, thank you very much. Thank you for playing. So that's what they will do. So settlement was often achieved by underhanded or oppressive means, which means if there was a particularly nice farm and so it would be just right for some Roman legionary who was retiring, you would grab it off your Greek owner. That happened. And obviously that breeds resentment. And also there was a law, for example, passed by Gaius Gracchus in 123 BC, which gave the right to collect taxes in Asia to members of the equestrian class, so the upper class, the knights, if you like. All of a sudden, these people have the right to go off into Asia, we're talking about Asia Minor, the Roman province of Asia, and to collect taxes on behalf of the Roman state. Now, when you do that, what's in it for you? Well, if the tax is, for example, 5 drachmae, you're going to collect 7 and keep 2 for your trouble. And obviously, the people of the region are paying too much tax, and it's a problem. And in case a community, because often whole communities were levied, in case they couldn't pay taxes, they borrowed from Roman lenders, and they borrowed at exorbitant rates. And this would result, of course, in the default on the loan, and consequently would lead the Roman lenders to seize the land holdings, which was the whole idea of the purpose of the whole thing anyway. So in this way, and by outright purchase, and there's another imaginary Hellenistic view of what was going on. So in this way, the Romans, and through outright purchase, and through all this money lending, and through the creation of these little colonies and the settlement of Romans, the Romans dispersed throughout, especially Western Asia Minor, and they fueled the discontent that Mithradates was capitalizing on, because these people have privileges. They are Roman citizens, which means they don't pay tax, they don't do this, they don't do that. They've got the protection of the Roman law. They get to do better. When you, as an oppressed Greek, see these people doing better in your own backyard, and you're a second-class citizen, you're not too happy. Okay. Now, Mithradates is now occupying a lot of the territory which was held by the Romans in Asia Minor. And he knows that the Romans are not going to accept the occupation of their province lying down, and he is fully aware that retribution is coming. And he knows that the Romans living in the Asian cities, which he now controls, are a potential 5th column. Yeah? It's my empire, but we've got these aliens living in there who support Rome, and this is a problem. We can't trust them. They're not on our side. We know that they will betray us given the opportunity. So he develops a plan that is both, if you like, audacious, and which will ensure that his name will endure in fame, infamy, I'll leave it to you, for all time. He sends a letter to the rulers of all the Greek cities in Asia, and he orders that upon the expiration of 30 days, all Roman citizens, and more broadly, all Italian peoples, because remember there's a distinction, different ethnic groups in Italy related to the Romans but not Romans, all Italian peoples in Asia Minor, men, women, and children must be massacred. Okay. And according to Appian, the letter says, 30 days, you're going to massacre all the Romans. Their bodies are to be abandoned and unburied. And the unburied is an important thing, because when a Roman or a Greek remain unburied, they don't have passage to the afterlife. Okay, so it strikes to the heart of their religious beliefs. And their property is to be divided amongst the rest of the city's inhabitants, and of course Mithradates will get his cut as well. And at the same time, Mithradates, in order to prevent the burial of the murdered, imposes penalties on the people who decide to bury the dead or help the Romans hide. If you do this, there's going to be retribution. On the other hand, he promises monetary rewards to informers and to murderers. To slaves, he promises freedom if they kill their masters, and debtors to deduct half of the sum they're owed to their creditors. So underlying what we could call possibly the racial criteria, according to which the victims are selected for destruction, slaves or immigrants from Italy who don't speak a Latin language are exempted from slaughter. So if you happen to have been taken from Thrace or Macedonia or Illyria or Dacia or Egypt or whatever, and you end up in Italy, and then from Italy you're taken to Asia Minor, and you're not an Italian, you're okay. But if you are an Italian or a Roman, you speak a Latin language, that's the criteria, you're a goner. Okay, now, the massacre is planned scrupulously to take place on the same day in several major towns and cities within Anatolia. So Ephesus, Pergamum, Adramitio, Kaunas, Tralles. Tralles, of course, is famous for being the birthplace of Anthemios and Isidoros, the architects of Hagia Sophia a lot later. Nyssa, and also the island of Chios, which belongs to that province. Now, estimates of the number of men, women, children killed range from 80,000, which is a big number for that time, according to Valerian, to 150,000, according to Plutarch. And the contemporary historians who write about this provide graphic accounts of the massacres, which we're going to have a look at now. And obviously, the massacres are something that inspired works of art in Renaissance, before and after. People reading the ancient accounts were inspired to paint what they saw, hence that. Which Penny here said to me, why are you sending me pictures of women and men in writhing? And I said, trust me, there's a reason for it. When we were discussing what we were going to do and the promotional material for the lecture. So the slaughter began in the city of Ephesus, okay? And what we know from the historians is that the Romans fled to the temple of Artemis, where they counted on asylum. You flee to the temple in ancient times, you hug the statue of the goddess inside the shrine, means you're free from persecution while you're doing that, because you're under the protection of the goddess. However, the townspeople tear them off the statues, so it's almost like a blasphemous, sacrilegious act. They're so intent on killing them. They drag them out of the temple, and as the historians say, they murder them with utter ruthlessness. The people looked at the murderers, say the historians, but the sight did not disgust them. They were happy because they saw in the Romans their greatest enemies, those who were the perpetrators of their miseries. Similarly, in Pergamo, the Romans hoped to save themselves by hiding in the temple of Asclepius. And the furious crowd, however, broke into the temple of Asclepius, trying to detach them from the holy statues, again to deny them the sanctuary conferred traditionally by doing that. And the persecuted Romans try to resist the murderers. So the inhabitants of the city, what they do is they go and fire arrows at the temple, ignoring its sanctity. And in the city of Adramitio, which is further up the coast, the inhabitants chased the Romans through the city to the sea, where the Romans tried to save themselves by swimming. And the inhabitants, however, continued their pursuit until they made sure that everyone was drowned, even the children. And you fast forward to 1922, 1923, and we remember similar stories about Pontic Greeks fleeing the Ottomans in boats and the Kemalists, and then being drowned in the sea because that was the way to get rid of them. And it's just spooky and eerie how similar methods are used to perpetrate acts of this nature. Now, similar events occurred also in the city of Kaunos, which is a city of Caria in southwestern Asia Minor. And there the Roman colonists hid in the city council building at the foot of the altar of Estia. And the Greek residents broke into the building, again ripping the Romans away from the altar. Then they kill their children in front of their parents. Then their mothers in front of their husbands. I'm quoting the historian now. And finally the men in the city of Tralles. The inhabitants were a bit more morally ambiguous, a bit shifty. On the one hand, they didn't want to stain themselves with the blood of the innocent because they were superstitious, and there were all these rules about ritual cleanliness and all these things in ancient times. At the same time, they didn't want to expose themselves to Mithradates as being hostile. Mithradates is now their ruler, and they have to obey him. They don't want to do this. It's a blasphemous act, and they know that, but they fear Mithradates. So what do? They hire a bandit who was named Theophilos of Paphlagonia, and he's the one who does the killing on their behalf. And the hired executioner brings the Romans to the Temple of Concord, and begins the slaughter there. And the Romans, obviously, who cling to the statue of the goddess in supplication, lose their hands before losing their lives. So, what's going on in the Roman camp while all this is happening? The Romans are thinking, what the hell is this? We've never seen anything like this. Where does this come from? Why? Now, some of the writers at the time believe that the Romans are being punished for religious grounds. And Cicero, for example, the famous Roman writer, he says this: there was a general opinion which had taken deep root and had spread all over the tribes in those districts, that our army had been led into those countries with the object of plundering a very wealthy and most religiously worshipped temple. And so many powerful nations were roused against us by a fresh dread and alarm. So in his own words, what Cicero was trying to say was that there was a religious origin of this violence. And in the same way that they were going to experience the Jewish wars a little bit later with Rome and problems that happened there, piety seems to have been the direct cause of the hostility and aggression. It was almost like a cultic obligation. We need to ritually cleanse these blasphemers from this area. So Mithradates, I mean, we talked about, is it a linguistically motivated, is it a politically motivated genocide? The Romans from the time were suggesting it was a religiously motivated genocide. So then the question is, why? That's not what we understand about the ancient Greek religion. No, there's the 12 gods, not really that vindictive. Everyone tries to do the right thing. There's a goddess called Nemesis which hounds you if you commit injustice. So what's all this about? Yeah. Now, St. Augustine of Carthage gave his own developed version of what happened. This was called the Ephesian Vespers, by the way, this massacre in Ephesus. And the reason why historians a long time later called it the Ephesian Vespers was because in the 1200s there were the Sicilian Vespers, and it was a similar thing. The Emperor of Byzantium wanted to destabilize the French in Sicily, because they were ruling Sicily at the time, and stop them from invading Byzantium, and he did that by rousing the Greek population in Sicily against their overlords. That was called the Sicilian Vespers, so then they called this the Ephesian Vespers because the historians of the time felt that there were parallels between the two events, which there are. Now, Augustine reflects on this and he says this: I say one thing though, how Mithradates, king of Asia, gave an order for a massacre on a single day of all the Roman citizens dwelling abroad anywhere in their own business, and this was done. What a pathetic sight it was when suddenly, where each man was found in a field, in a road, in a town, in a home, in the street, in a marketplace, in a temple, at a banquet, he was without warning and without regard for the gods treacherously butchered. What groans there were from the dying, what tears for the witnesses, even perhaps from those who dealt the blow themselves. So there's a few additional points about what's going on here and why it's happening, and you can feel the consternation. I mean, Augustine was writing centuries after the event, and yet he felt it deeply. Appian talks about how the Roman corpses were to remain, to not be buried, but to remain discarded. And there are very few cases in Greek history where that happens. One is with Antigone. Remember the story? She wasn't allowed to bury her brothers. But you know what? We're going to talk about this now because I think this will give the right perspective on Mithridates' motivation. Mithridates was a Zoroastrian. Zoroastrianism is an ancient Persian religion which still exists today in small pockets of Iran and also in India, where Zoroastrians fled after Islam became dominant in Persia. It's a dualistic religion. What they believe in is that there are two main deities or supernatural entities, one being the god of goodness, Ahura Mazda, and one being Ahriman, the god of evil. And these two gods are constantly fighting each other for dominance. It's not like the Christian religion where there is a loving God on top of everything. These two, they're evenly matched. And the whole idea is if you're Zoroastrianism, you're on the side of Ahura Mazda, you're on the side of good, you have to fight evil because evil is evil. And we don't want to be evil. So, and one of the things that you have to do is you have to bury your dead. you don't bury your, well, actually you don't bury your dead. You actually can't bury your dead in the Zoroastrian religion, because by burying your dead, you're actually polluting the ground. So what you do is you leave them out for the vultures to peck at and for the elements of, you know, birds and whatever to strip the bodies clean. So we're looking at possibly a religious reason why why Mithradates would not allow the bodies to be buried. And we know that there's precedent for this, because Mithradates has fought other wars, and Mithradates fought a war against the kingdom of Galatia, which is just between Pontus and Cappadocia in the middle. And he orders a similar action against the rulers of Galatia. He says all the rulers of Galatia must be massacred in one night. And they are. So there's a recurring pattern of Mithradates Epator scheming the destruction of enemies in a single stroke. So on a Zoroastrian point of view, we're all Zoroastrians tonight, in the war which this king decided to wage against Rome, there are only two acting powers. The good, represented by Mithradates himself as the supreme chief, and evil, which is represented by Rome. So, in his mind, this conflict with Rome is part of the incessant battle between good and evil that's been going on since the cosmos was created, and he's just a player in that. It's a battle which has existed before. It will continue to exist after he's long gone. He's now playing his role in that battle. During the course of this archetypal war, the enemies are seen not only as mortal opponents, but as we said, as the very agents of evil, the personification of evil, Satan himself, if you like. And regardless of their age, their condition, their sex, their political affiliation, what they feel, what they're doing, nothing like that. Because they are Roman, in his mind, they are evil. Yeah? Now, when you consider them in this way as a religious category, not an ethnic category, not a linguistic category, these antagonists need to be destroyed, because in the end, their only objective is to fight the good, the light, and the truth. So their existence is inimical to the very existence of the world and humanity. They have to be destroyed. Now, this is something that obviously is informing his vision. This is his religion. This is his worldview. This is how he sees the world. Okay? Now, we know from history that the Persians, especially previous of that in the Achaemenid period, would indulge in wholesale massacres of certain populations that they considered evil and had to be wiped from the face of the earth. How do we know this? Because they wrote about it in cuneiform script on boulders and rocks and mountains, and we can read all that. And we see that there's some type of cosmological motivation which is suspected, and there's a ritual, a Zoroastrian ritual which existed at the time, which we know from texts, known as the Khravstar, which is a kind of a cleansing. It's kind of a cleansing, a ritual cleansing of evil from an area, and almost like the scapegoating of the Jews, where they take together, the Jews would take together a goat, for example, send it into the wilderness, and that was symbolic of removing the impurity from a place. These people would get animals and sacrifice them and slaughter them, whether they were rats, snakes, lizards, rodents, and that was a way of cleansing the area from evil. So the argument is that what Mithradates is doing symbolically by choosing these innocent Romans to be targeted is he's cleansing Asia Minor from evil. There is a religious motivation. And in the Zoroastrian tradition, where they did these ritual slaughter of animals, it would be for a prescribed period. It would be for one day. The slaughter will only be for one day, or for 2 days, or for 3 days. And again, we see that here, it was supposed to happen in the space of one day. It's whoever you kill in one day. Whoever's left over tomorrow, that's okay. So it's a weird kind of thing. So the point is, there they are being nice, and that's Hellenistic kings there. And that's the battle between good and evil, according to later Persian depictions. So whether or not Mithradates is attempting to rid the world of cosmic evil, the consequences would die. Yeah? Mithradates had created a very, very large fleet that scoured the Aegean of Romans. And Pontic forces occupied many vacated parts of the Hellenic world, and he subverted the city of Athens, making use of his partisans there, so he even got to Athens, including the peripatetic philosophers who really, really liked Mithradates. He could not take the port of Rhodes, which was important because Rhodes was a massive shipbuilding and trading centre. The Rhodians were master mariners, and on their ships the Romans had designed their own. So then when the Roman general Sulla rocks up to conduct a siege of Athens, all of mainland Greece had rallied to Mithridates' cause. There was a series of conflicts which took place called the Mithridatic Wars. As a result of those wars, Mithridates lost. And most of the Greek states or kingdoms which had hitherto avoided the Roman rule came under Roman rule. So in the end, not much to show for it. That's Mithridates there on that coin. So bringing everything to a close, can we call this the first Pontian genocide? The definition of a crime of genocide as contained in Article 2 of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide says, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group as such. 1, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births among the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So this is how the international law defines genocide. Now, we can draw our own conclusions. It's just one of those sad and strange coincidences of history that 2,000 years later, another genocide would be perpetrated, this time in that region, one that will extinguish a 3,000-year-old history in the region of Asia Minor, and that's the genocide that we commemorate today. And the questions are obviously, can we call this a genocide? We can possibly raise that in the discussion, but the whole idea is this. What is frightening is how similar traits exist within humanity that cause people to be inhuman to each other. In Ottoman times, it was the Greeks who were considered a fifth column. We were living as second-class conquered people within an empire that was multi-ethnic, but in which we were not considered equal citizens. We were considered, if not racially inferior, because there was no concept of racial inferiority in Islam, but religiously inferior, which means we had less rights, which means that they could take certain liberties with us that they couldn't among people of their own religion, okay? And we see parallels between the Ottomans justifying the massacre of infidels with Mithridates justifying his massacre of people that in his mind personified evil itself. So let's think about that for a while we also reflect on the fact that mankind's innate beast is something which is common to all people and not just a particular race. It's in everyone. It is very easy to incite someone to commit violence, to discriminate. And what we need to do is to make sure that these traits, this capacity, is nipped in the bud so that further massacres, further genocides never occur. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean. That was very thought-provoking. I will start the first question. I'd like to ask you if we can evaluate historical events from a modern perspective when it is really difficult to comprehend the historical context fully of a previous time.
Absolutely.
When I was listening to you describe Mithridates, I was almost fully understanding what was happening because it was religious. Yep. The fact that let's call them executions, were ritualistic, they only lasted for a day or two, really pointed to a religion. But at the same time, I thought this idea that when people aren't with us, we're against us, and that sort of creates aggression too.
Absolutely.
And then I couldn't help but think about the Kemalist genocide, where nationalism was almost a brand.
Yep.
So can you
and that's the
talk
whole
a bit
idea.
about that?
It is complex. Genocide is a complex thing. I mean, does it fit the international definition? Who says that the international definition is the definitive definition anyway? I mean, that's the definition which penalises and criminalises genocide. So it's a legal definition. It's not a cultural definition. The international community of scholars have got their own definition of what a genocide is. In this sense, can we argue, if Mithradates was up before the World Court, that, well, he didn't intend to destroy the whole race of the Romans, therefore it's not a genocide, and the proof of that is the fact that he didn't try and do that everywhere, and that the fact that he only did it for a day, and anyone that was left over, he left alone. I mean, that would be his defence. I'm a lawyer by trade. If I was going to defend Mithradates, which I would never do, that is the defence I will be using. He didn't intend to destroy the Roman nation in total. He didn't even intend to destroy the Roman nation in the area where he was. It was for one day, it was punitive, and it was not about destroying the Roman people as such. It had a religious connotation. That's being legalistic, yeah? And that is the problem with legal definitions of genocide. They don't cover the humanity on the ground. They don't give us context, as you said, Spiridula, as to the motivation and what's going on. And I say this. For me, whether you call it the first Pontian genocide, which I do that as a question to provoke and get us to think, myself, I don't know whether that was the first Pontian genocide, whether we should be calling it a genocide or just a massacre, because there was no concept of genocide at the time. My legal hat tells me, well, just because a crime doesn't exist on the statute books at a certain period of time doesn't mean you can't look at it later as a crime. It's beside the point. I mean, Hitler committed genocide, and that genocide wasn't criminalised until later. The whole idea of genocide being created as a crime was in response to Hitler's perpetrating of terrible acts, and obviously before that, Samuel Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, was much interested in what had happened to the Armenians. So is it a genocide? And then the next question is, so what if it is, so what if it isn't? The fact of the matter is that there were certain events which caused this person to decide that innocent human beings were expendable and could be killed. And I think what is important is not the legal definition of a genocide. So here I am negating my entire premise of my talk, but what are the factors that cause somebody to look at innocent people and say, you're no longer human? I can't see you as human. I see you as infidels. I see you as agents of evil. I see you as miasma. I see you as disease. I see you as scum. Therefore, I'm going to get rid of you. That's the thing we've got to look at from a human perspective, because in each situation it's different. But yet, there are always common elements. And the common element is that bit where you get tipped over the edge and you stop viewing people as human beings and you no longer have compassion for them, regardless of the reason, the justification, or the method.
Thank you, Dean. Would someone else like to ask a question?
Easy crowd.
Okay, Dean, thank you very much. I'd like to invite Penny, who's standing right behind you.
Oh, Penny.
It's Abunopoulos.
Poor Penny standing here under the lights in her kondohuni and macro uni. Sorry, that's the big one. Yeah, there's a longer one. The the macro uni. That was last season.
So, on behalf of Merimna Pondion Kirion, Oceania, and Pondiekistia, we would just like to extend this little gift as a token.
Thank you so much.
Every year, the time that you spend to put these presentations together, and very insightful today. At least I know now with the pictures.
That's
it.
Good. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody else. Thank you to Estia. Thank you to Ms. Romasiaco, our sponsor. And obviously, Spiridula will tell you about the new and exciting things which are going to happen next.
Thank you. And this is from us at the Greek
I will drink them on the way home while I'm driving.
No, you're not.
Just before you all go to the back for a cup of something warm, I just want to talk about next week's presentation. It's the 26th of May. Professor Papadiamantis will present an online lecture entitled The Battle of 42nd Street. May 27th marks the 81st anniversary of one of the most difficult battles involving the Australian forces in the Second World War. On that day, Australian and New Zealand infantry battalions staged an assault on the regiment of German troops along a defensive line that was called the 42nd Street, just south of Crete's Suda Bay. Professor Monti's lecture will examine the background to the Battle of Crete and the series of events which led to the charge. So that's an online event and it's going to be streamed just like tonight's was as well. I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really special to be gathered all together in this space let's remember our Pontian brothers and sisters who were lost, and as Dean said, always keep in mind what causes people to tip over and think in such horrific ways with such enormous consequences for generations to come of these people. Thank you so much.